one of those I'm one of those visual learners, and I do that didn't work. Hang on. One of those visual learners, and I always think it's a little bit easier to have some pictures. So what I thought we would talk about today is what's happening with the new district lines. And I thought before we went too far, we need to take a little bit of a step back, which is, you know, we don't care about district lines because we're weird cartographer map people and all we think about is maps. No, we care about these maps because they're directly connected to democracy. And, you know, when we think about gerrymandering, and you'll remember, you know, the old political cartoon that I have here, which was from February of 1812. When you look at this crazy district lines that are here from Massachusetts in 1812, that was really the beginning of manipulating district lines to manipulate elections. And we care about, you know, these state legislative district lines, you know, and congressional district lines, because we are concerned about government. You know, we want to participate in meaningful elections, and we want to ensure that the people who we send to Columbus or we send to Washington, D.C., that they truly represent us and are accountable to us. And that's why we really care about gerrymandering. Now, if you followed map making during 2021, it was so disheartening. You know, we went through this process where many of us, you know, attended the public hearings, and we wrote postcards, and we sent emails, and we made phone calls, and we attended rallies at the State House, and there were all sorts of different things all over the state that Ohioans were doing to ensure that the map makers knew that we deserved good district lines. And so it was just incredibly painful to watch and to see, you know, the maps that were created, you know, first the state legislative maps created by the Ohio Redistricting Commission, and then the congressional maps that were created by the state legislature. And, you know, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through first what happened with the state legislative lawsuits. And then I'm going to walk us through what happened with the congressional lawsuits. But, you know, it's such a good thing that the Ohio Constitution was actually changed so that we have good rules in place, that we weren't just, you know, left with these district lines, and that we, we're left feeling, you know, sad and empty, but we could actually go to court. And so I think it's really important to realize that the efforts that went on during the fall after the map making, and this is state legislative, so Ohio House and Ohio Senate, that there was a whole process going on, and a legal process to ensure that the district lines didn't stay. And what happened is that on January 12th, the Ohio Supreme Court rejected the new Ohio House and Senate districts that were created in September. And they basically said, oh, you all didn't even try. You did not even try. And you act as if Section 6 of the Ohio Constitution doesn't actually exist. That we have rules in place. And this is actually really important to think about. When we were going through the reform process, many of us will remember 2013, 2012, that we were having conversations about, well, what is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering, we know it's manipulation of district lines. We know that it is unfavorable to one political party over the other. We know that basically it's politicians choosing their own voters. But sometimes you actually need a standard. You need to say, okay, well, what does it actually mean? And so in the Ohio Constitution, in Section 6, there are proportionality requirements. And essentially what this means is, we call it sometimes fair representation. This is a standard that political scientists use. And you all will remember Professor Dick Gunther, who is at Ohio State University, was the person who really said, okay, it probably isn't enough just to say you can't gerrymander. We need a standard. And so Section 6 of the Article 11 of the Ohio Constitution really focuses on how do you get to that standard. And what they said, what it says in the Constitution is that you need to look at 10 years. And in over 10 years, you look at those elections, you look at the number of Democratic votes, you look at the number of Republican votes, and that's how you come up with the standard. And so the standard is approximately 54% Republican to 46% Democratic. And so what happened is, the maps didn't meet this. And in fact, Ray DeRossi, who was one of the map makers, essentially said, I was never told to meet that standard. He described it as aspirational. And in fact, when you look at you go back and you kind of look at what it is that was said in the records and what, how it is that the defendants were saying, okay, the Ohio Redistricting Commission was saying, oh, well, we made these district lines. And, it said, we should try to do this, or, shall attempt is the language. We just took that as inspirational, that, aspirational, not something that we actually have to do. And what happened is that the Ohio Supreme Court, the majority of the court, and you'll remember that it was Melody Stewart was the justice writing, and she said, okay, there's a standard in the Ohio Constitution, and we need to look at the statewide preferences. It's a way to measure gerrymandering, and it is literally in the Ohio Constitution, and you cannot ignore it. Now, I have that specific line. If it is possible for a district map to comply with Section 6 and the other sections, the commission must adopt a plan. Now, what that means is there are other rules that are in the Ohio Constitution. So those rules focus on keeping counties whole, then cities whole, and townships whole. It's a notion of, if this is another way you can reduce gerrymandering, you keep communities together. You say, okay, we're going to focus on keeping our political subdivisions together. So essentially what the majority said is, if the Ohio Redistricting Commission can keep communities whole as much as possible, and remember, you're dividing those lines because of population, that they actually have to do it. And one of the things that that the defendants or the Ohio Redistricting Commission lawyers argued was essentially that all of us were really behind, keeping the communities together, but we didn't really care about the anti-gerrymandering provisions. It wasn't something that we cared about. And they said, oh, the shall attempt, well, okay, maybe that, that makes it less meaningful. It makes it inspirational or aspirational. It's just, we don't care about it. And I thought it was really important that Justice Stewart just, highlighted that Ohio voters would not have rallied behind this amendment. They would not have rallied behind, all of the work that folks have put into this. That we wouldn't have done this if we actually believed that the amendment that was about gerrymandering was toothless. The reason for the shall attempt, and I was there in 2014, is that it's actually a challenge to balance keeping everything together and making sure all over the state that you get to that representational fairness standard. Now, you can do it, but we were concerned not just about 2021 map making, but 2031, 2041 map making. And so that's why the language was shall attempt. And one of the things I think is really important is that we came to this structure where we expanded the apportionment board in 2015, and we put in some strict rules. We came to this because for many years, we had been promoting an independent redistricting commission. And in 2005 and in 2012, there were citizen initiatives to do an independent redistricting commission. And those efforts failed. And so we went through this process where we were negotiating with legislators and trying to come up with what seemed really workable, which is this standard of saying, okay, we're going to give it to elected officials. We're going to give it to those folks, but we're going to tie their hands with rules and transparency. And yet, as you know, Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor pointed out, they're drunk on power. You might give people a second chance when they get a DUI. We gave these folks a second chance. They're drunk on power, and now it's time to take away their car keys. Maybe we should be thinking, you know, we need to get through this process and we need to do everything we can so we have good maps for the next decade or next 4 years and then the next decade, however it works. But no matter what, we should be thinking bigger, because what we have learned from this is that these elected officials, these partisans, they don't play nice, and they're not thinking about Ohio voters. They're thinking about their partisan interests. And I thought it was really important that the Chief Justice, who was looking at all the things that were put in front of her, took a step back and said, okay, we need to fix this now, but maybe we need to think really big. Maybe we need to think beyond this year. Let's think about whether we need to have an independent commission, because those independent nonpartisan commissions have actually been much more effective. Okay, so that was January 12th. Was the day that the Ohio Supreme Court said, okay, you get back to work, gave them a spanking, gave them specific instructions to meet the representational fairness or proportionality standard. So 54% Republican leaning districts, 46% Democratic leaning districts. And what happened? They were given 10 days, which means that on Saturday, they created these two new maps. And I pulled up, Howard Wilkinson described this as a game of 3-card Monty. He's, you know, that whole notion that these, you know, the sleight of hand, and it's great for magicians, but not so great for the people who are actually drawing our maps. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through a little bit about what happened. So let's see. So what's wrong with this, the second attempt with the maps? So what I did here is I put the house breakdown here. So you're talking about there are 57 Republican leaning districts and 42 Democratic leaning districts. However, if you look more closely, what we're really talking about is 57 Republican leaning districts and 30 Democratic leaning districts and 12 that are toss-ups. So meaning they're, you know, 51, 50, you know, they're super close. They're 1% or less between Democrats and Republicans. On the other hand, of the toss-ups that are deemed Democratic, the Republican districts all have at least 52% Republican partisan index. And so the other thing to think about is the Senate. I did not include that in the slide, just, you know, figured more information that way, but you're talking there, what they said, oh, there are 20 Republican seats, there are 13 Democratic leaning districts, but it turns out that there are 20 Republican leaning districts for Senate, and 9 are leaning towards Democrats, and 4 are toss-ups. So I thought it might be interesting to look at a Hamilton County map, just to give you a chance to think about this. I think the thing, you know, when we talk about the manipulation district lines, you know, sometimes we talk about the packing and cracking. And I think when you look at Senate District 9, what you can see is packing, where they packed, you know, all the Democrats into a district. And you can see, like, you might need to move, you know, the pictures of people talking or whatever, but you can see the kind of wiggling and squiggling that they did. There's that thing where you're like, are we sure it's actually contiguous? And I'm going like along the Ohio River, you can kind of be like, okay, that's an odd one. So what they did is they packed Democrats in, and then they ended up cracking out for Senate District 8. And so as opposed to what could easily have been 2 Senate seats that were leaning towards Democrats, they created a situation where they have a Senate seat that's Democratic and a Senate seat that's Republican. Now, of course, when we think about competition, of course we want more competitive seats, but we also want to ensure that getting to those competitive seats doesn't, in fact, limit the proportionality across the state. That, in fact, when you're thinking about competitive seats, it shouldn't be like, oh, all the Democratic seats are competitive and the Republicans are not. So you can imagine this is a problem. So one of the things that happened yesterday, at about midnight, was that the League of Women Voters actually filed a complaint. And so they are challenging these maps. So the plaintiffs, or the people who were unhappy with the maps, they had an opportunity. They had 3 days to complain. And you might say to yourself, wait a second, they had 3 days to complain, 10 days to make the maps, 3 days to complain. This is a very compressed schedule. And it is, it is a really tight schedule, but we have to remember that the primary is just around the corner. And with that primary, people they're filing deadlines. There's changes in the voter file so that you can get voters in the correct districts. So things are moving fairly quickly. I suspect we will hear from the court fairly soon about whether they're sending the map making back to the Ohio Redistricting Commission, and what new safeguards they are going to put into place for that. So we have to stay tuned for the state legislative maps. And now we're on to Congress. But before I go any further, did anyone have questions about kind of the state legislative process? Ariel, did you want to go off mute?
Yeah, thank you. So my question is about the maps that were submitted during the map making process in the fall that met all the standards. What happened to those maps?
So one of the things that is super interesting is it's not as if the Ohio Redistricting Commission did not have maps that met the representational fairness standard, and that also focused on keeping counties whole, cities whole, townships whole as much as possible, with divisions only for population. And so for example, the fair districts had a mapping competition. These maps were submitted, and they were quite good maps. There was also the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission that went through a whole process. They didn't just create the maps, they had, public input into them and conversations about them. There were folks. And
they got them in on time.
They got them. Oh yeah. So the notion that they didn't actually have maps that would meet the requirement is nonsense. They really intentionally did not choose them. And I think one of the things that is challenging is, we put rules in the Constitution. They're very clear, and elected officials, governor, auditor, secretary of state, and that they just didn't pay any attention, and that they focused on their partisan interests rather than on the voters. And I think one of the things that was, I think for me especially challenging, is I've been participating in conversations with legislators since the late 90s about how to improve things. And, this was a compromise, and it was a compromise that was really spearheaded by Vern Sykes, who Democrat on the commission from Akron, and Senate President Matt Huffman, Republican from Lima. So it's not as if they didn't understand what they put in the Ohio Constitution. Together, they co-sponsored it. And yet we were left with not a terribly transparent process. Vern Sykes and Amelia Sykes, his daughter, who was the minority leader, they were basically excluded from the map making process. So even though we were encouraging bipartisan map making. At the end of the day, you know, they created a 4-year map that violated the Ohio Constitution because it favored their political party. And then they did it again.
Yeah.
And then they did it again.
Yeah.
So, you know, one of the things that was very upsetting in the process this past week is, okay, so on Thursday, I come down to the State House and I wait and I wait and I wait because they don't actually get back to, I'm like, I waited forever. So they finally hold a very short hearing, you know, and a short is relative. It wasn't as short as the one on Tuesday, but it wasn't 20 minutes, but it wasn't the kind of in-depth conversation that they should be having in public if they wanted to craft a Democrat and Republican map together. They said, hey, this is our plan. What we're going to do is we're going to go through different metropolitan regions, and as opposed to trying to like draw the entire state, it's, you know, let's like look at different regions. And so they started with Franklin County and they started with Hamilton County. And the Democrats had a map that they proposed, the Republicans had a map that they proposed. And when they ended on Thursday at about 5:30, they said, hey, we're going to come back in the morning on Friday at 9:30 in the morning. We'll reconvene. And what we'll do is we'll keep going through different regions. They did not come back Friday. They did not return. So they like didn't do a sunshine notice like, oh, we're going to be, you know, like the usual thing where they tell you when they're going to meet. They just got into recess on Thursday. So they just stayed in recess until Saturday. And they didn't even reconvene on Saturday morning. They reconvened, I guess it was close to like 2:33 at that point. But there was that point where you're like, what is going on? We're going to get to the point, we're almost 48 hours from the time the meeting ended on Thursday to when it reconvenes on Friday, and on Saturday. And then there was no conversation about regions. The Democrats and Republicans both had their own maps. And when the Democratic map maker got up, Matt Huffman, Republican Senate President from Lima, then basically grilled Chris Glassburn, who was the map maker, about the Democratic maps. So the grilling of the map maker took the place of any kind of conversation about how they could improve one another's maps or change one another's maps. So it looked like they were getting something done, maybe, but they weren't. And at the end of the day, about the point that the Bengals were wrapping up their game on Saturday, the maps were being wrapped up. And those are the 4-year maps that have now been contested for being as unfair as the first maps.
I'm wondering if the compliant maps that were submitted as part of the record are part of the case that you all made last night.
So yes, so one of the things that's interesting is that there is what sometimes people will call it the Roden map. There is a Professor Roden from Stanford, and I'm going to take a quick drink of something. There's a Professor Roden from Stanford who drew a map that on January 12th, that first decision, the Ohio Supreme Court said, oh, this one is compliant. Here is a map that literally, here's a map you could use. They didn't use it. So the plaintiffs or the groups that actually sued about the maps originally, they did include information about the Roden map. They included a second Roden map, and they also shared information about the citizen maps as well. And I think that's really important. You know, 2021 was really different, not just because we went and testified and we rallied and we wrote postcards, and it also was different because people were participating in a way where they were able to make maps. And yes, we had a redistricting competition in 2011, but not, I mean, it wasn't as robust, and we didn't have that ability to make what we would think of as kind of the community maps, where if you weren't really wanting to do entire Ohio map, you know, when you think about it, 99 districts that are embedded in 33 Senate districts, I mean, it's a lot. So this is really the first time that we've had easy access to like Districtor to do these community maps. And so one of the things that's clear to me at this point is their pressure is coming from a variety of different ways. And we have certainly provided enough information so that it is very clear to the Ohio Supreme Court that they didn't have to do it this way. They just didn't have to.
Yeah.
Oh, someone asked if I put the maps back up. It'll take me a second. Hang on. Here we go. All right. So here are our maps. They're a little hard to see. And so one of the things that I can do is I can share with Alice, you know, links so that you know, and follow up information. Alice, is that something you can send out afterwards?
Yes,
Right.
I'll put it on our website and I'll send it out to the people who have attended. Yeah.
So, you know, one of the things that is interesting is you can look at the maps and they don't necessarily seem completely crazy until you get into the metropolitan, like what you would think is more populous counties. That's where they did most of the mischief.
Mm-hmm.
But of course you can look, like if you go to House District 96, which, you know, that kind of weird shaping there. I mean, you can identify some odd kinds of ways that they have connected things. Any other questions, or anybody want to make a comment?
Yes, would you define the partisan index and who figures that out?
So the partisan index is in the Ohio Constitution, and so basically, okay. So what it says in the Ohio Constitution is that what we'll do is we will look at how Ohioans voted over a 10-year period in statewide elections. And so you're talking about US Senate, you're talking about governor, auditor, secretary of state, any of those president. I hear you too, but you need to wait. Sorry, my cat is trying to get my attention. Anyway, so if you look at that, you then look and see how many people voted Democratic, you know, for the Democratic candidate, how many people voted for the Republican candidate. And that's how you get the 54% for leaning Republican and the 46% leaning Democrat. How do you figure that out when you look at voters across the state? That gets a little bit more complicated. They use these things called voter files. And, you know, we'll take my neighborhood, for example. I'm a Democrat, independent. We have a Republican that's that direction. But you can look at communities and you can say, okay, I'm going to look at this precinct block, and I can see that this precinct block is a Democratic leaning precinct block. And that's how you start to break out the entire state as the Democratic partisan index and the Republican partisan index for the whole thing. And the thing that's really interesting, you know, when we think about these maps and we think about elections, you know, we like to think, oh, I just vote for the person, and it, you know, why exactly does this matter? But then you start thinking about, okay, well, if they're not representing my community and they do these weird district lines, and they have the ability to really fine tune them, because of course in 1812, you know, you could draw a weird district based on, okay, I think I know this neighborhood, this makes sense to me. It's a very different thing if we're actually using computers to do this. So one of the things that we know from the software that can be used is that they can add additional layers. For example, they can figure out how many people, I don't know, have the Sierra Club magazine, and they can start to get a better sense beyond the voting patterns about how conservative, oh, here's an NRA member, or they can get that information as well. And it's one of the reasons that gerrymandering has become much more specific, and the ability to, like, every once in a while, you're like, why did they do that just around those 3 houses? You know, that ability to use other than, you know, in the 90s, when they created the district lines, they had this gymnasium, you know, this gymnasium with paper to try to figure out the whole thing. And you can imagine, like, you know, just the difference between making the maps that way and making the maps where you have this ability to be like, oh, here's a Democratic household, here's a Republican household. Just the difference of that is just kind of astonishing. Any other kind of questions? My cat is very excited to participate in today's presentation. That is the lovely part of it, isn't it? Of working from home. All right, I will stop here. Just any kind of questions or things about this? Someone had asked about a map. So one of the things I'll do too is I'll make sure Alice has my slides. And these are something you will also have access to, and I'll make sure that you can see them on the website as well. Does that work for you, Alice?
Yes, and I will, I'll put them on the website, and I'll also, yeah.
All right, so I pulled this political cartoon because it just gave me hope. Supreme Court stopping it. And so we're now on to Congress. Okay, so the rules that are in the Ohio Constitution are different for Congress and for the State House. And one of the things that is interesting is that in the state legislative map making, there's the partisan index that we talked about. Hey, there's a representational fairness standard. You know, you have to look at 10 years, you have these specific races. Well, that's actually not in the Ohio Constitution for Congress. There are rules against drawing district lines to favor or disfavor one political party or the other. And I think that's really important because in one circumstance, we have really tight rules. In the other, we had rules that were really focused on keeping, you know, communities whole, counties whole, really focusing on that and compactness. But that even without that very tight standard, the Ohio Supreme Court really highlighted how very terrible these district lines are. And the last sentence, I always think, this plan defies correction on a simple district by district basis. We invalidate the whole thing. Like, the whole thing was so terrible. And in fact, you know, there was Judge Donnelly actually said it looked like it was actually worse. Actually worse. You know, actually worse than the 2011. And to think of, like, all right, how many of you picked up clipboards? How many of you wrote letters and sent emails and participated in hearings? You know, we as Ohioans have been trying to fix this process, you know, seriously since 1981, when we had the first citizen initiative. And it's just incredibly, you know, just incredibly sad. Okay, so the congressional maps, they declared unconstitutional. You need to get started again. So what's next for them? So with the state legislative maps, you know, really tight deadlines. They only had 10 days. In this case, the Ohio General Assembly, the state legislature, has 10 days out. So we're talking, you know, we're talking about the time that you will be smooching your man or giving your person a hug, Valentine's Day. That is the day that we should have new congressional district lines from the state legislature. Now, Senate President Matt Huffman says that he plans to go to Florida for a couple days next week. They do fundraisers down in Florida in February. So he will not be around for a while. And he said, oh, don't worry. We're not actually going to do anything with the maps until February 7th. In other words, okay, so I understood that they didn't immediately get started on the congressional maps because, of course, They wanted to make sure that they focused on the state legislative maps. The Ohio House and the Ohio Senate maps, they need to take care of that because that deadline of 10 days. But literally, they're not going to worry about this until the 7th of February, which means they plan on doing this for a week.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they are not successful at actually crafting congressional district lines, keep in mind, we're talking about you need to have 30% of both political parties. So it isn't just, oh, we're talking about the state legislature passing this. We actually need to have buy-in from both the Democrats and the Republicans. If that is not successful, and I think we should assume it won't be, right? Like maybe it will be. It seems likely, if they're only giving themselves a week, that what it'll do is it'll go back to the state from the state legislature to the Redistricting Commission. Now, when we already know the Redistricting Commission didn't do the best job when it came to the state legislature, I did add their names here. I think that's the one thing I wanted to note here is, we're talking about, the governor, auditor, secretary of state, and then we have the Speaker of the House and Senate President. We have Senator Vern Sykes, who was engaged in redistricting reform since the 90s. I was going to say he was somebody who was active with Joan Lawrence and League of Women Voters way back when. But Amelia Sykes has been replaced by the new minority leader, Allison Russo. And so I just wanted to highlight that for you. So that's what's next when it comes to Congress. But I think we should be thinking about, I don't know, sending some Valentines off to our members of the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, just letting them know that in fact, what they really should be doing is getting to work on those congressional maps, and that we expect fair ones that don't favor one political party over the other. And then I included this slide because, we're Ohio, we're focusing on what's happening in Ohio, and it's been incredibly challenging, but this has been happening all over the country, except for those states that have nonpartisan or the citizen commissions. And so, as we think about it, this is a challenge. Yes, we're facing this challenge trying to get good voting districts, but this is something that is happening all over the country. And, I keep thinking back to, 2018, when we passed our congressional redistricting reform in May of 2018. Then there was a challenge to the congressional maps. And then, there was this lawsuit that was said, hey, we had a Democratic gerrymander in Maryland. We have a Republican gerrymander in North Carolina, went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and Russo v. Common Cause went to the U.S. Supreme Court. I should be very clear. Sorry. Went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that there's no role for the federal judiciary in addressing partisan gerrymandering. And so we are very blessed because of lots of you and lots of hard work that people have done all over this state to put good rules in the Ohio Constitution, because the federal courts are not going to protect us. And we need to be thinking, yes, hey, what are the next steps? What are reforms? We need to do what we can to put as much pressure on the process. But that sense that this is a challenge all over the country, and we all deserve to participate in meaningful voting meaningful elections, and we all need to have our voices heard. And gerrymandering is a voter suppression tool. Like, a lot of times we don't necessarily think about that, but the manipulation of district lines is the manipulation of our vote. And then, of course, it's also the manipulation of public policy. And on that note, I'm guessing there's some, Ariel, you were the person who drove up to Cincinnati? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't stay very long because I arrived in time for the hearing, and the 9 other people there said, "Oh, they're in recess, and we don't know when they're going to come back, and they're going to give us 90 minutes notice before they come back." And I'm glad I turned around and went home again and went to the Rotary meeting, because I'm thinking, you sat there all day for nothing. They ran off to celebrate the Intel deal. And you say they didn't come back at all, really, except for a couple minutes.
They didn't come back till the next day.
And then Saturday, they didn't come back till 2:30 in the afternoon. So probably they were having brunch or a Bengals pre-party or something. Who knows? But that is so offensive, and they know that thumbing their noses at us would discourage us. You know, it's like, we can do what we want. So given that they got closer to the 54-46, but with all these really razor thin so-called Democratic districts, what do you think the justices are going to do?
So what they're going to be looking at is whether Democratic and Republican leaning districts are treated differently. And so there are a couple different ways they're treated differently. So one, the Democrats have the competitive districts. Okay, so that's a challenge. The other thing that is interesting is there are more people in the Democratic districts. Meaning, okay,
they were so happy that they were within 2 voters of meeting the exact equality.
Yes. So many of us have heard the one person, one vote. And so in the 60s, it was determined that basically it was unfair to have one district have way more people than another district. And this was actually common. And it was also common in Ohio, where we did districting by county. And so you could imagine, the farmers having, more power because they fewer people than, the folks in Columbus or the folks in Cleveland or Cincinnati, right? So it was determined that it wasn't actually fair that you need one person, one vote. So the congressional districts are really close, that across the country, when it comes to congressional districts, folks try to make those districts really close, like less than 1% difference in population is very common. It's like 0.7% is one of the differences that is even contested. Some folks say it needs to be as even as possible. So that's Congress. For the state legislature, because of the nesting of there are 33 Senate districts. In those 33 Senate districts, there are 3 House districts. Mm-hmm. And to do that, it's very difficult to have the population be so close to equal. And so there's more wiggle room when it comes to the Senate and the Ohio Senate and Ohio House districts. Now that wiggle room is necessary because of the way that we do district lines, but it is not appropriate for Democratic districts to have fewer voters, humans, population than Republican districts. So there are a couple different ways to fight this. Also, there's the whole thing of like Ariel was saying, hey, we have examples. It's not like this. This is some kind of holy grail, and we have no idea how to get to these perfect maps. Oh no, we can't do it. No, there are examples that are out there. They could have used any number of those maps, including the one that the Ohio Supreme Court specifically said was constitutional. They could have started with that and then, did some changes and say, no, we don't like this or like that. But that's not what actually happened. Now, one of the things, I realize as I've gone through all of this and I've told my tales. Oh, by the way, Ariel, you might actually be glad you weren't with the Ohio Redistricting Commission, because Frank LaRose has COVID and he wasn't wearing his mask.
Oh, that's right.
So like,
Yeah. I'm vaccinated, and I had
I
mine.
am too, but like, there was something about, okay, if I get one of those breakthrough cases because I was working on redistricting with an
Yeah.
Secretary of State, I'm gonna be mad.
Right.
Yeah, not good. Yeah, by the way, I feel fine.
Good. You look great.
I mean, my usual snuffly allergy stuff, but I'm fine. No, it's just incredibly hard. I did want us to, like, as we're thinking about this, not to end on a completely, oh my God.
Catherine, we do have one question
Oh,
in the
sorry.
chat room. One question from
All right.
Carolyn. Can the Supreme Court order the legislature to use one of the other maps which are better? And I think yeah.
So this becomes a little bit complicated. The Ohio Constitution says that the map making authority falls to the Ohio Redistricting Commission, meaning when the maps go back, they actually have to be finalized by the Ohio Redistricting Commission. Now, it could be that the Ohio Supreme Court gives really specific instructions. They look, for example, at Hamilton County District, you know, the one that I highlighted for you because I thought, hey, this is understandable. And they say, okay, this specific district is where you could get to. Like, they can be very directive. Some states, the courts establish what they call a special master. It's like a map maker to help. So I think that's possible. The other thing that there was a question. So the hearing on the state legislative maps was December 8th at the Ohio Supreme Court. And at that hearing, there was a question that Maureen O'Connor had, which was, so if we send this back and it doesn't work, we're going to send it back. And then she said, this could go on ad nauseum. So like, so not that this should depress us, but I wanted to highlight that the Chief Justice had an awareness that getting them to do the right thing could be a challenge. And it sounded, you know, obviously it's a questioning series, but it sounded like she was prepared to not be worn down by nonsense and just keep doing it until they get it right. So some of us, you know, we think about the DeWolf's decision and we think, okay, how long ago did they tell our state legislature to do better on education funding? And, you know, there was a point where the Supreme Court just was like, okay, we don't know what to do to make these people follow the law. In this case, I do believe that the court, you know, will do the right thing and get the, you know, keep sending them back till they actually get it. And that they may give very specific instructions about how to do the transparency. You know, in many ways they were violating sunshine law. There was, you know, you could see people go into side rooms and then come out, and like, so there are things like that they could highlight as problematic. Even the whole, oh, we're just going to leave the map making until December 7th kind of thing, you know, leaving the map making to the very last minute. If you knew you had 10 days to do maps, would you just sit on your hands and wait and not actually announce a public hearing until you got to Sunday before it was due on Saturday? No, you would get started. Let's see. Ooh, oh, all right. I liked Ariel's question here, which was, do you think Justice DeWine is the author of the unsigned dissent? So this is what I think. I think that 2022 is a year where we vote for justices on the Ohio Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, right? Okay, so whoever signed this is likely up for election, right? Because otherwise, why wouldn't you, like, why would the dissent, and this is the people that says, oh no, that map is fine, and this is for the congressional maps. Well, I hate to say this, but if you're not willing to sign your work and own your work, you don't want to be tagged with it. And it could have been any of them that didn't want to be tagged with it. But certainly we know that Justice DeWine, whose father is Mike DeWine, did not choose to step aside. He didn't choose to step aside, he chose to hear the cases. It may very well be. Do I think? I think it's possible. I think it's highly likely, but I also think it's really disheartening that no one signed their name to their work. It also suggests that they are not, how can I put this? There's a little bit of shame in the world, right? Like there must be some sense of shame, or you would just sign your name, because that's the way it works at the Ohio Supreme Court. They said, oh, sometimes they're unsigned dissents, for U.S., for U.S. Supreme Court, but that's not something we do for the Ohio Supreme Court. Anyway, this is to remind you all to make sure that you vote when it comes to the judicial part of the ballot. Any other questions? And I guess I just didn't want you leaving thinking, oh my Lord, we've gone through all of this. We still don't have good maps. I do feel like we're doing all the things to get there. And it often takes a lot of work and a series of small things that all of us can do to actually get somewhere at the end. And we may not be the geniuses that Van Gogh was, but we are amazing voters and Ohioans, and we deserve better. And with that, Alice, any questions or anything I should do?
Well, thank you, Catherine, for updating us. And should we keep up with those postcards and those emails too? Do you think that will help?
So I do think that at this point, we're talking about to your state legislators, and this could be as simple as sending a postcard, sending an email, making a phone call. Just letting them know that we're paying attention. One of the things I was really interested in yesterday is there's a news service called Gongwer that the lobbyists get, legislators get. Gongwer was doing a poll of legislators to see if the legislators thought that their constituents cared about redistricting. I don't think there's any question that we care about redistricting, but let's just make sure we remind them. So I highly encourage them to get started as soon as possible. Ask them to create the maps in a transparent process where there's an opportunity for the public to weigh in. And then, finally, that you want to make sure that, they keep your community together. If you're focusing on keeping your community together, especially in Hamilton County, that means you're going to have much fairer districts.
All right, we thank you for your time, and we'll keep watching and look for what's going to happen. I think they ought to send them all to jail if they don't come up with the right thing, but that's not going to happen. Okay, thank you everybody for attending, and
thank you all. Thank you, Alice.